Greetings comrades and welcome to the new video. Today we will be preparing vinen kebab or wine kebab. I know that kebab typically is meat on a stick made in the Middle East, but for some reason we call stew with wine kebab. I'm not really sure why. Maybe the word kebab have some different meanings in different countries and different languages, and we took the meaning that's representing a stew. Maybe this is my guess, but I don't know it, so this is just a guess. And this stew screams to me like childhood. This was maybe my favorite thing to eat as a kid, with the gyuvech, and maybe gyuvech and this stew were my favorite. Every time when babushka had some pork, I wanted her to prepare this stew to me. And typically it's very easy to prepare and has very low amount of products, which was always an advantage when you don't have a lot of money. But it calls for some wine, and we are happy to have some relatives who have some vineyards and they produce some nice wine. So my grandma and grandpa always had some nice red wine on the side, and that's why they prepared this stew a lot, and we enjoyed it quite a bit. Maybe the only problem for us was that pork was very expensive. I mean, it was not very expensive, but basically the money that they received were very low amount back in the day. So it was like a little feast, a little holiday when we had pork, being pork chops or being some pork for cooking or being some meat as a whole. But we always had some saved, or we always had it like 1 to 2 times a week, so it wasn't that bad as most people would describe it. And this was like 25 years ago, 22 to 25 years ago, so it wasn't that far in the past. I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, but I remember it very, very clearly, like the smell, like my babushka on the stove who was preparing this stew. And I would say that I managed to transfer her knowledge into today's recipe, so feel obliged that you learn how to prepare this stew. I mean, it's very special for me, so I hope you enjoy it. I know it's very common to some French beef bourguignon, like it's very similar, but first, this is not beef, this is pork, and second, this is my babushka stew, it's not some French stew. And most of the time we eat it just with plain white rice. In the rice we put some butter and that's it. But you can eat it with other carb sources, like I really enjoy it with some mashed potatoes or with some polenta or with some bread, nice white bread, just dipping in the sauce. And with that said, let's see how this stew, which is my favorite stew, is prepared. Okay, we start to prepare our wine stew by cutting some onions. Most stews and most savory recipes, as you know, are prepared with big cry apples, and without them it won't be the same thing. For the purposes of this recipe, we need to cut the onions into very, very small cubes, like that. If you don't want to use a knife, you can just process like some onions into a food processor, and you will spare some time. After that, I have around 1 kilogram of pork meat from the ham. I add some pepper and salt on top of it with this electric grinder. And after that, we need to start preparing the stew. I'll mix the pork a little bit and I'll start frying my onions into some olive oil. And make sure, if you have such type of cooking utensil which you can use on the stove and after that in the oven, use it, as we will bake our stew for some time in the end. When the onion is soft, we should add the pork so it can start cooking and getting softer. Typically, if you sear it from all sides, which is the main point here, its juices would remain, and yeah, it should get gray like that. And have in mind, it may look like it's ready, but it won't be ready. And this recipe calls for adding some peppercorns, like whole peppercorns, and some allspice, like again, you should add the whole seed. After that, we add some paprika and some tomato reduction, which will boost the flavors. And have in mind, at this point of time, the only liquid you should have is the oil, so the pepper and the tomato can start frying. After they fry for some time, we will cover with around 200 to 300 milliliters of nice red wine. We should cook that meat until there's no wine left. Basically, again, we are aiming for the only liquid left in the pot to be oil, which may take some time for the wine to evaporate. But this wine will in the same time make our meat tender and will add very nice flavor to the stew. And as you see, it almost evaporated here, and we cook it for some more time until there's no wine left basically in the pot. At that point of time, I will add some water to cover the meat. You can add some broth if you have, but I didn't have, so water would work too. The wine and the meat are good enough to season our stew, so you don't need broth, but if you have, it's a nice option. After that, we'll prepare some slurry with flour and water, around 2 to 3 spoons of flour and enough cold water to dissolve it. I add some bay leaves, the holy bay leaves for Slavs, into the pot, and I'll add some salt. The wine was a little bit acidic, so I add 2 spoons of sugar, and I continue to cook the meat until it gets soft. When the meat is soft, I would add the slurry so it can thicken our stew, and a little bit more water. Basically, at this point of time, you can simmer for some 20 to 30 minutes, or just put it into the oven for an hour and a half on low heat until it becomes something like that. If you have the opportunity to bake that, do it. It would make the meat even more tender, and it would bring some very nice flavors from the oven, and it would thicken very different from the stove. But if you don't have the opportunity to bake it, so only the stove would also work. And for side dish, I've chosen rice. As I said in the intro, you can go with different carb sources, but this is the traditional way we eat it, with some boiled rice. I choose some jasmine rice because this is the only rice I had at home, to be honest. I boil it for some time only with some water, and after that I will add some butter, because rice and butter are best friends basically, and this would be our carb source. I add it into a plate. This is typically how we ate it back in the day. You have that pot with rice. Babushka is putting some meat and sauce into the plate, and you put some rice directly from the pot. But I did the other way around this time. I add from the stew, add some nice sauce, add a lot of meat, and typically we add some lemons on the side, which you can put the juices from on the rice and onto the meat. And this is basically the stew. It's one of my favorite stews, to be honest, from my childhood. Every time Babushka offered to prepare it, I agreed. So yeah, it's one of the best stews.
Comrades, this is the best stew you can ever make. To be honest, you can substitute with beef, but this is the best. I mean, you should try it.
The Slav difficulty level for that stew would be 3 out of 5, because yeah, it's a stew, and if you bake it, it has some additional steps. I would say 3 out of 5. And this was all from me for today, comrades. I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned how to prepare wine stew with pork, or how we call it vinen kebab, which means wine kebab. And yeah, I know it has nothing to do with kebab. And this was all from me, and I'll see you next time.